Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Hilliard. She kind of explained everything there. I'm the vice president of the Kitsap Peninsula Mycological Society, and came down here for your spring mushroom fair. That was cool. Looking forward to the NAMA foray. Rumor has it I might get to be one of the foray leaders, which is exciting. So just getting to go do all kinds of cool mushroom stuff. And it's all thanks to my YouTube channel, Mushroom Wonderland. So if you don't know about that, make sure to go over there. Also on Instagram, Patreon, TikTok, Facebook, everywhere. There's some free stickers on the table over there for anybody who wants them. But today I'm going to be talking about morels and their allies because it's morel season right now. And the groundhog was right. Spring did come early, so it's been morel season for a couple months already. And it's just getting started in the mountains, So it's been a good morel season so far, and it's staying cool in the mountains, which means morels are still going to be sprouting as we chase the snow line up into the elevations. But today, as program director at KPMS, sometimes it's hard to find people to talk about morels, and so I was always thinking, I should just do a presentation about morels, and then Rose asked me to do this, so it just worked out perfect. And the way that I learn the most is through education. So when I'm making videos and researching stuff for my videos, and I end up learning a ton, so opportunities like this teach me more than I'm teaching you. But I'm looking forward to this opportunity to be teaching a mycology course at the Olympic College. Going here forward, it's just like a dream of mine to just turn mushrooms into my life. So we'll get started. So morels and their allies. So morel mushrooms, arguably the most highly prized edible fungus in the world. The morel market size for 2023 worldwide estimated at $688 million. They grow on all continents except for Antarctica. They're easy to ID, but they're tough to grow. And this picture on the left was taken by a friend who's a chef, and he was at the World Food Championship. The $10,000 prize-winning dish was cashew-stuffed morels, like landscape morels right there. And then on the right is a picture of some free breaded and deep fried morels at my house, which I think probably tasted better. So I don't know. So what is a morel? So it's in the kingdom of fungi. It's in the Ascomycota, Pizziziales, Morchellaceae, the family, the genus, Morchella. 68 known species of true Morchella worldwide, and that number is always changing, and there's probably more than that, but as people are doing DNA sequencing and things like that, we get to learn a lot more, because morels are one of these mushrooms that can look a lot of different ways, but it'll be the same thing, so it's confused people for eons, the taxonomy of morels. So what is an ascomycete? Morels are an ascomycete. Next to that is a Gyromitra, below that a Helvella, and then there are some true tuber truffles, which are ascomycetes. All the false truffles are basidiomycetes. But the ascomycete truffles are the good ones to eat. And if you look on the right, then it's basidiomycete, so your guild mushrooms, your port fungi, even the bird's nest, the Nidula, Nivea tomentosa, those woolly bird nest fungi are more closely related to your guild mushrooms than they are to morels. And then in the bottom corner, also basidiomycete, Psilocybes cubensis. People know all about the magic mushroom. So the main difference between those two divisions of fungi is ascomycetes produce spores in a cell called asci, which they'll typically produce 4 or 8 spores. Morchella species, 8 spores per asci. It's a little tube that actually uses air pressure to shoot the spores out. Where a basidiomycete grows spores on basidia, typically 4 spores per this cell called basidia, and so some of them only grow 2 spores, like for example your grocery store button mushroom, Agaricus bisporus, meaning by 2 spores grow on the basidia, and they more drop out into the wind currents rather than being ejected like an ascomycete. I've got a lot of slides here, so I can't ramble too long. I'm going to try to keep moving. The word morel comes from a Latin word for brown. That's what it's thought, in the 1670s, from a French word called morile or moril, a word of uncertain origin, apparently from Germanic, compared to Old High Germanic, German morchel, meaning a mushroom. Anyways, the French probably comes from moril in French, probably from Vulgar Latin, maricula or maris, meaning brown. First known use in 1653. The Morels were thought to have originated here in Northern America, but new studies suggest that the earliest Morel was Morchella rufroburnea, which is a woodchip Morel that we have that actually grows around here. But they think it was the first of the Morels, and it diverged from Verpa 129 million years ago. Verpa is a genus that we're going to talk about in a minute of early Morels. And so it was in the Cretaceous period. It was coming to be around the time of Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops and pterodactyls. It's retained its ancestral fruit body, hasn't changed for over 100 million years. So it's really a pretty ancient mushroom that hasn't felt the need to change much. The earliest study and classification of Morels was typified by Christian Persoon in 1794 with Morchella esculenta. He actually signified the genus Morchella. So Christian Persoon was a French mycologist. The taxon Morchella elata, whose true identity still remains unresolved, was described by Elias Fries in 1822 from a fir forest in Sweden. And so the story of the Morel naming gets weird. This Morchella elata is somewhat elusive, and they don't even have a type specimen of it. So it's actually become more of a common name than it is a actual taxon, but that's to be debated. So welcome to the wild world of confusing common names. So as we saw in the previous slide, Morchella is the scientific name of the genus of the true Morels. The common name Morel covers many more types of mushrooms, even different genera of mushrooms. So there's early Morels, there's false Morels, thimble Morels, landscape Morels, burn Morels, blonde Morels, black Morels. We got all kinds of Morels. And so it can be a little bit confusing, but I think we're trying to get everybody on board. And a lot of this is through Facebook groups that I hear a lot of discussion about trying to make common names more recognizable. So early Morels, Verpa bohemica, and this is a riparian mushroom that grows around your cottonwood, around the river basins here, low in western Washington, Oregon, Northern California, British Columbia. They're the first on the scene. They're not in the genus Morchella, but they are very similar. They have a cottony pith inside of the stipe. The cap can separate from the stipe. It attaches at the top, where a Morel, the cap and the stem and everything is kind of fused together. This is like two different pieces. They're naturally occurring. They're thought to be truly mycorrhizal. And it says edible with caution. A lot of older literature was cautionary about eating Verpa, but studies have been done. People were, a lot of mycophobia bled into that idea, but I think they're just as safe as any Morchella. Just cook them, just make sure to cook them. We'll talk more about that later. Then there's the thimble or the bell Morel, Verpa conica. This one is more of a montane species. Usually when hiking around on the east side of the Cascades looking for natural Morels, you'll come across these. They're also in the genus Verpa. They're edible, but they're so fragile and tiny. You usually find one or two of them. When you go to pick it, it just kind of crumbles apart in your hands. I don't even know how anybody would get it into the pan. So it's probably, you know what I mean? By the time you cooked it, they would just disintegrate to nothing. It would be just a waste of time.
How big are those ones?
They're, typically about 3 inches tall, and they're just very small. I've tried to extract them and carefully, but you're hiking through the elevation. You got Morels bouncing around in your basket. Those things just get obliterated. So now the false Morels. So people have generically used the term false Morel to cover a few different mushrooms, but it's trying to be narrowed down to the Gyromitra esculenta clade. So that's what we're talking about here. If you've ever seen these, they look kind of like brains. The one in the center is kind of an odd color, so that one maybe shouldn't be there, but they're typically a really dark rusty color with a pale stem. The genus Gyromitra contains over 70 different mushrooms commonly referred to as false Morels. Members are distributed primarily throughout northern temperate and boreal forests of the northern hemisphere. So Europe, Asia, North America, really common here. They're ascomycetes with discoid or cerebriform, meaning they look like a brain, or saddle shape, apothecia. and they come out in the spring. We have, I think, Gyromitra infula comes out in the fall here, but mainly spring is when you're going to see the Esculenta. They have a long, complex taxonomic history with transfers from different genera and whatnot. So now we have what we call snowbank morels. And these ones often grow near the snow line as the snow is receding to higher elevations. These like to grow in that cold, wet soil where the snow just was. A complex of mushrooms kind of commonly called Gyromitra gigas group. And so the one around here that resembles those ones from Europe are Gyromitra montana. And they're growing like crazy right now. And they're said to be safe to eat. Just treat them like any other morel. Just make sure that you cook them. Don't eat them raw. These include quite a few different other species. This one on the right is known as the big red Gyromitra caroliniana. And people love eating those down in the south. And so you can often find these when searching for natural morels here in Washington. I just went Saturday and came across a bunch of these beautiful ones. So we're going to cook them up and eat them and make a little video about what I think, how they taste. So your false morels, Gyromitra esculenta complex, they're toxic, especially when raw. There's a lot of documented poisonings, even deaths from Europe. They are, some people call them the beefsteak mushroom, which seems incredibly misleading to me. I think we need to leave that behind. Or the Morchella. Esculenta means delicious. Isn't that weird, right? Or good food. 2 to 4% of all mushroom poisoning fatalities are attributed to these mushrooms. So they have a long history of poisoning people, but also of being esculenta. So up until World War II, they were considered edible, even choice, and highly revered in French cooking. People just ate these mushrooms. Maybe they didn't make the connection between a lot of the poisonings that happened and the mushrooms themselves, but people ate them. And I imagine they cooked them well too. Literature showed hints of caution around the turn of the 1900s. It was given that name esculenta by Christian Pursoon, the same guy who named Morchella genus. The following year, he revised the old genus name for Morels from Phallus to Morchella, where it still is. He loved eating them, so he named it esculenta because he thought they were delicious. By 1907, mycological and medical records showed 160 cases of poisonings, but people were still eating them in restaurants and stuff. Back then, they called the active toxin helvelic acid because it was in the genus Helvela. So now we call it gyromitrin because it's in the genus Gyromitra. It's kind of weird how the chemical changes names with the genus. I thought that was interesting, but it breaks down. Gyromitrin is a type of monomethylhydrazine. So hydrazines metabolize into rocket fuel in your stomach, can make you really sick and suffer some really nasty like neurological disorders and stuff. But it breaks down around 189.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The fumes can carry the toxin. There's a way to detoxify these. You can boil them. They say boil them for 10 minutes in a ventilated space. Take them out, rinse them, and then boil them again. Again, making sure that there's ventilation, and then cook them as you would any other mushroom. Seems like a ridiculous process to go through for a potentially dangerous mushroom, but after World War II, people were starving in Europe, and they had to do what they had to do, so they learned ways to eat these mushrooms, and a lot of that didn't translate, so they become dangerous today because they do contain toxins. So gyromitrin metabolizes into monomethylhydrazine. I forgot this slide was in here. It destroys your red blood cells. It's toxic to the central nervous system, damages liver and gastrointestinal tract. You notice the symptoms start 6 to 12 hours after ingestion: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, headache, convulsion, coma, and even death. So it could be carcinogenic, causes tumors in rats. And it could cause long-term damage. There's been studies about it causing like ALS and weird Parkinson's-like diseases and stuff after eating for a prolonged period. It is present in most Gyromitra species, but less or none in snowbank morels, and it's even been detected in Agaricus bisporus. Your grocery store button mushroom has some hydrazines in it, but easily cooks down. So at 189.5, it breaks down. 212 is boiling. So if you get the water boiling, you're pretty much breaking it down. Oh, here's the double boiling detox method. You clean the mushrooms, boil for 10 minutes, remove discard water, make sure the area is well ventilated, rinse, repeat boiling process again. saute as you would any other mushroom at your own risk. I'm not suggesting you do this, but people do it. And over here, this is I think it's from Finland or one of the Scandinavian countries, but they're selling the Gyromitra esculenta in the markets there. Okay, so now we're at true morels. And there are generic group terms, right? So we have blonde morels. The esculenta clade contains 27 different species of blonde morels. The black morels, or the elata clade, containing 36 known species of black morels. We have half-free morels. There's 3 different species of those. Landscape morels, 3 species. Burn morels, 5 different species. And natural morels, 6 different species. So a lot of different morels. So we're going to start with blushing morels. I mentioned them before. They were first on the scene. Morchella rufrobranea clade, which is just 2 species, and one of them doesn't grow in America. The Aniticola grows in Europe, but these ones on the left are the blushing landscape. Rufrobranea derives from Latin roots meaning reddish brown. So that's the blushing part. They kind of turn a rusty color on their edges. These photos were taken by my friend Alan Rockefeller in Northern California. They're really common in California, less and less common up here. It acts like a saprobe. So it's perhaps facultatively mycorrhizal, meaning that it could hook up with trees and plants, but it doesn't need to. It likes to grow on wood chips. But Rufrobranea, here there's 1,039 observations in the USA on iNaturalist, but only 7 observations here in the past 8 years in Washington State. Really rare one to be finding here in Washington, but as you get down south, it's warmer and they seem to like it there. But it's unique. It's got that pointy conical cap. It's got really irregular pits, and it's got that reddish brown kind of staining on it, making it unique. So blonde morels. This is the Morchella esculenta clade. So if somebody goes, that's Morchella esculenta, that was like a really old taxon from Europe, and it's become a common name that covers all of these different blonde morels. And so 27 different species, and they signify it genetically as MES. So if you see MES 1 through the number 27, that means Morchella esculenta 1, Morchella esculenta 2, all the way up to 27. And there's a little tree of all of those different blonde morels, not many of which grow in Washington State. Morchella americana, known as Morchella esculenta number 4, described in 2012 as distinct from Morchella esculenta, different from the original taxon. So in 2012, Michael Kuo, a mushroom expert, did like a whole bunch of like naming of these species and connecting them to their DNA sequence or whatever. So that's where it gets MES4. It occurs in cottonwood, apple tree habitat, sometimes in orchards on the east side of the mountains. They're more common down in Oregon. Pretty rare here, but I actually was at a state park and I found a cluster of them popping out of the side of a fire pit on Blake Island in the middle of the Puget Sound. So they do occur here, but it's somewhat rare. Let's see, Morchella prava, the other blonde morel, even more rare. There's 5 observations in the entire United States on iNaturalist. But I think it's more common than that. It's just people aren't putting it up there yet. It's more common up in the upper Midwest, but apparently it occurs around Oregon. And very strange morphology there. So really squat and really dark pits that are very irregular and really blonde ridges. So that one sequences out as Morchella esculenta number 7. So I'm just going over the ones that grow in Washington, basically, ones that you might encounter. There's a lot of morels to talk about, but so the black morels are the distantes clade. So if you use iNaturalist, sometimes if you put in black morels, it'll say distantes. That just means the group of black morels, and the elata clade. So we've got all these like names that signify groups of mushrooms. It's really kind of confusing in morels. But there's 36 different black morels, 14 of which grow in North America. Morchella elata, common name, was originally applied to the European morel, then became broadly generic to include all black morels worldwide, then later discovered that the real European Morchella elata may correspond to phylogenetic lineage Morchella elata number 10, which has since been described from North America as Morchella importuna. So that's our landscape morel. is thought to be the same mushroom that they call Morchella elata in Europe. So Morchella conica, sometimes you'll hear people say that, and especially like commercial mushroom pickers say Morchella conicas. We're out picking conicas. And it's another term that covers early burn morels. So it covers a few different species of burn morels. So it's on a subgeneric level. It's considered an illegitimate taxon. So if you hear people saying conicas, it kind of covers Sextulata, Eximia, and perhaps some other burn-associated morels. Morchella importuna, I just mentioned that one. This one pops up. It's a very urban and cosmopolitan morel that probably you've seen this spring if you've got your eyes on the ground. They've been growing everywhere. You can find them growing in gardens. They grow saprobically, so they don't need trees or plants to grow with. They grow on wood chips, garden beds, cardboard, sometimes trash. My TikTok channel actually went viral because I came across this, an old garbage dump that had like clothing and stuff that was all mixed into all this trash, and there was 1 million Morchella importuna growing all over the trash and in the garbage. And I was videotaping with my phone, and I uploaded it onto TikTok when I was kind of new on that platform. And the next morning I had like 800,000 views, and I got like 24,000 subscribers overnight from that. So these are like, they can grow in some pretty trashy places. In fact, the ones there on the right I found growing in the garden, in the wood chip bed next to Wendy's in Bremerton, Washington. And I wouldn't be eating those, but I do chop them up, mix them with water, and I throw them in clean wood chips around my house, and hopefully they'll grow some fresh ones, be cautious of accumulation of heavy metals because they grow in the city, and they can grow, right where there's runoff from roads and whatever. But sometimes it's hard to resist. If you find a bunch of beauties, we just look past that road that's right there. Everybody does it, you do it too. So they're conical, they're pointy at the top usually, and they have ladder-like pits. Their pits are arranged in vertical ladder-type situations, whereas like Morchella esculenta or Morchella americana, very random honeycomb-looking deal. These are more like ladders. And they're very tough stipes. When you go to like pull one out of the ground, they're not fragile. They're very hardy mushrooms. They're also one of the easier ones to cultivate. I'll talk about that later. Morchella snyderi. This one is our montane natural morel that grows on the east side of the Cascades. I just went Saturday, and they're popping up, and they're so fresh and thick and young and beautiful. And you got to work for them though. They're not easy to find, and you'll never see these like commercially sold because you hike for 3 hours and you get 18 mushrooms. But they're delicious, and they're some of my favorites. The stipe is totally like clustered with tissue matter. They're very, very thick, heavy morels that kind of can go against that idea that all morels are hollow all the way through, because you can take a cross section of one of these and the whole stem is just convoluted with all kinds of folds of material in there, and the little hollow cavity inside there is usually pretty small. So they're tough to stuff. If you're a cook, you might know, there's not a lot of room to put stuff in there. But these are large. They grow Mother's Day through mid-June, east side of the Cascades, but they chase the snow line up as it they like it a little bit cool, right in that perfect range, 50-degree soil. And so up at the highest elevations, people are finding them still in August, But those are hard areas to get to usually. This one, Morchella brunea, this is our natural lowland cottonwood riparian associative mushroom. So this one thought to be mycorrhizal, growing with these cottonwood trees. And they're often just growing singularly, but walking along a river edge underneath big mature cottonwoods, you can often fill up a basket within a couple hours of these. And they have, they're one of the first morels on the scene. They grow lowland, so earliest in the spring, you're going to start seeing these ones come out. And if you look on that picture on the left, they have what's called a sinus, that little gap. I think Danny Miller on Alpental calls it the ant racetrack, that little gap right there. So you'll see that on Brunea. And not related to Rufro Brunea. This one is in the Morchella elata clade, but it just means brown morel. Morchella norvegiensis. So this one, when it's really young, it can look kind of pinkish. And it's our natural conifer associating blonde black morel. I don't know, it's tough to describe some of these. This one, it is conifer loving. It grows in your chanterelle habitat. It grows deep in conifer forests that are just popping out of the moss. So it seems to associate with conifer trees, and it's one of my favorites. I have a patch that I go back to every year. They're always growing at the same place. Oftentimes they're kind of growing out of a hillside or a swale. You'll see that a lot of times. And whenever you find a little patch of these, don't tell anybody, but you can go back every year and get them. And yeah, they often look very blonde, but they fall into the mel clade, the Morchella elata clade. They're somewhat rare, and because of their rarity, I think they're extra delicious. Morchella populophylla, this one, growing, it's riparian, so it grows along rivers, the lowland rivers here associating, again, with the populous genus, so the cottonwoods and poplars and stuff. These like to grow under the cottonwoods, and they're just as good as any other morel. And you can see the cross section of that one that was found around Auburn, cut in half. And the morel, it's attached to the stem halfway up inside the morel. So that's why they call it a half-free morel. East of the Rockies, there's a different species. I think there's 2 other species of half-free morels. But these are another early one that will come out with Morchella brunea. Underneath your cottonwoods and along the river banks. They like that sandy soil. Most morels like sandy soil. Morchella tridentina. This is a beautiful, beautiful, we call it the mountain blonde. If you watch my channel, I recently released a video about finding these ones. And just a random state park here in Western Washington underneath big leaf maple, which typically don't associate with any mushrooms, but I was amazed to see hundreds of these growing everywhere in the ferns, on the leaf duff, on sticks. They were just acting saprobically, humongous flush, as big as this whole room. And, you know, I've been back every year since, not a sign anywhere of them, you know, which is another trait of a saprobic mushroom. They've colonized, they ate, they went to spore, they took off into the wind, and they're not back because they're not attached to those trees. They also have an ant track on them or a sinus. They have ladder-like pits, but they can be a little more irregular, and they can be very blunt. And if you look at that center picture, that one is a morel growing off of a stick. So it's kind of like proof that morels don't have to be mycorrhizal. It's just growing right on the end of the stick, and they're very thick and beautiful. That basket of them is some of the ones that I found there, and they're just heavy, gorgeous mushrooms that seem kind of unpredictable for me to find. So it's sort of like chasing a unicorn. You're not going to go out and be like, I'm going to find Morchella tridentina today. Usually you're looking for something else, and then you come across them. This one is known as Morchella elata too. So even though we call it a mountain blonde, it's actually a black morel. So burn morels. Pyrophilous fruits in response to heat. They only grow after a fire. They can wait for 50 years underground as sclerotia, which is, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's one of the sexual reproductive cycles of morels. They can hunker down in the soil forever. Some people believe they even live indefatigably inside of the cells of plants or trees, waiting for a fire to come along. They seem to prefer fir and spruce forests, but this year I've been in some burns that have just kind of thrown all of that out the window. We found them with oak trees and scotch broom and all kinds of weird stuff. They do what they do, and whenever I think I know something for sure about them, they prove me wrong, you know. Here, so this one would fall under that group of Morchella conica. So if you ever heard commercial pickers, when they speak about picking morels, that it's always kind of like a lackluster, like, well, we were picking conicas and then we got into the grays or the greens. And the conicas are sort of like a lower echelon of, I mean, they're still choice edible morels, but they're thinner, and they're kind of this tannish color, and they can even look kind of blushing like the Rufra brunea, but typically kind of more of a gold color. And when you cut the stem, it's just a single thin wall of a stem, and you wouldn't know the difference until you see a double-walled one, and then you go, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about now. But they're limited only to conifer burn sites. So Morchella sextillata and the next one I show are impossible to visually differentiate just by morphological features, so you got to use DNA. So I think that's why a lot of people just say conica, because it could be one of these two species. Sometimes they're called a pink morel, and when they get big, they can get really pink. I just saw somebody sent me a picture the other day of a baseball-sized one that looked super pink. It was really cool. So Morchella eximia, also synonymous with septimulata. This one, it fruits in burns and rubble, like construction site areas. It loves disturbance, and it's only distinguishable from the former one, sextillata, through DNA sequencing. So when you're out in a burn and it's the first flush of burn morels, it could be eximia, it could be sextillata, and septimulata is an old taxon. It's synonymous. So if somebody discovers a mushroom and they go, this one looks different, then I'm going to name it septimulata, and then the DNA sequence comes along and they go, nope, that's the same thing as eximia. It goes back to the old name. It always goes back to the old name, unless they take it to the nomenclature congress and like go through this huge process, but rarely does that happen. Morchella exuberans. So this one is this is typically the second flush burn morel. So all the conicas come up first in a burn, and then the second flush are going to be these thicker Morchella exuberans. Some people call them pickles or greenies, and they have a greenish tint. Kind of looks like my hat, inside the pits. Is that kind of greenish color. They're super thick, and the walls are like double walled, so it's almost like a mushroom stuffed inside of another mushroom on the more pronounced ones. These ones are very exciting to find and a little bit more rare than the conicas, but when you walk into a big patch of them, they can add up quick and they weigh a lot. So commercial pickers really like them. Then Morchella tomentosa, this is what people call the grays, and they're probably the most highly sought after burn morel. Definitely the most highly sought after burn morel, but I know some people that would rather have exuberance. But these start off sometimes black, often gray with a really dark stipe. Sometimes the stipe is just kind of tan color, but it's never creamy or white colored like the other morels. It's always got a darker colored stem, even though that the contrast in the picture is making me look like a liar. But as they get bigger and older, they will turn blonde. And so it can be really confusing. You're in a burn and you're like, there's a black one, there's a gray one, there's a blonde one, there's a gold one. And you probably just have two species, or if not one. They just change morphology a lot as they age and mature. But these are really fuzzy. Excuse me. They're very fuzzy, and so that's how they get the name tomentosa. Tomentos meaning fuzzy. And they're superior burn morels. Morchella importuna sometimes will show up on the site of a burn, usually due to the disturbance, whether there's firefighters and things digging up the ground. They'll be growing out of the gravel along the edges of the burns, but more typically in like garden beds and stuff. These pictures I actually took in Kitsap, Washington, in this area. It was where there was a house fire the year before a house burned out. They came and took a bulldozer and cleared the house out, and then where it was standing, all these morels, all these Morchella importuna popped up, and they were delicious. Well, thank you. So when and where to find morels? General rules. They've been known to grow in construction sites where there's disturbance, where sheetrock has been allowed to disintegrate. You've seen big clusters of morels coming up around sheetrock, which is interesting. Corrugated cardboard that's been left out in the rain. They like that kind of stuff. It's weird. They're sort of nasty that way. They like to just grow on garbage and stuff. Or fresh wood chips. My mom had a bunch of like poplar trees chipped up, and it was like clockwork. I went over there like the next spring, and there was more morels growing all over. So in some ways, they can be a little bit predictable that way. The bottom line, they like it when the ground goes from cold to warm. So, we have two big mushroom seasons in Washington. So fall being our huge mushroom season. And that's when the ground is dry and hot, and then it gets wet and cold. And a lot of mushrooms prefer that. But morels like that cold ground to warm up, and then that's when they're going to pop up in the spring. Typically in the spring, well-draining soil. They like sandy soils. That's why all these riparian early morels, your brown, your Morchella brunea, half-free morels, they like growing along the edge of river banks where it's sandy. And the soil around 50 to 52 degrees for about a week. Some people even get like a food thermometer and put it into the soil to see what the soil temperature is. about a week of that, and humidity, which we have no control over, is definitely a factor in how they're growing. But most people use the temperature of the soil as their rule of thumb to start going out and looking for them when the soil temperature has been 50 degrees or more, or around 50 degrees for a week. So there have also been freakish eastern burn morels, so fire-associated morels. Widely were believed to just be limited to Western North America, but there's been freak occurrences that have proved that to be wrong. In 1977 in Minnesota, Morchella angusticeps, a natural morel, was reported in Minnesota in mixed jack pine and black spruce forest in 1977, a year after a wildfire. So this is a known natural morel that grows there that just came out in big numbers after this fire. So I don't know if you'd really call that a burn morel, but some way that fire had conditioned the soil, really, the mushrooms really like that. And if you want any references to this stuff, most of the slides I have references, I can get you that stuff. But in eastern Ontario in 1991, a black morel identified as Morchella conica. So we just learned that's just like a generic name. So it means kind of nothing to us now at this point because there's no record of it that was saved. But it was collected in May 1991 following a prescribed burn. So again, this one being Morchella conica could be several different mushrooms. Like we don't really know exactly what that was. Michigan Upper Peninsula and the Tennessee Smoky Mountains, Michigan 2012 Duck Lake Fire, they found big chunky black burn morels. And same as in Tennessee 2016, a preliminary phylogenetic analysis suggested that the collections, I don't know what all that says, but they're Morchella exuberans, they're greens, they're pickles, they're the good burn morels that we have here are popping up over there, which is curious that it wasn't known to happen before, but the more and more reports are happening of burn morels popping up out east. So just like last year around Boston, this guy Chris Hafford put on iNaturalist 5 pounds of burn morels, had him DNA sequenced once again, came back Morchella exuberans. So our second flushing green burn morel, it was tested twice. So right around Boston, interesting. And this year in Virginia, just earlier this month, Pat Mitchell and his son Levi found lots of burn morels in Virginia after a fire, had them sequenced, came back again, Morchella exuberans. So the old western forest fire burn morels might, they might be spreading. I don't know, it's interesting. So where to look in a burn? The first year after a fire, always the best. So whatever fires happened last summer, right now is a good place to go. Second year burns, everybody will tell you a different story, but the consensus is not that great. You can find them there, but it's like, I don't know how far you want to drive or go for that. I've never heard anybody say it was outstanding the second year. It's like, we found a couple. It's usually what I hear. Conifer forest in the west. I don't know, maybe I need to edit that. But the orange needle burn, so Langdon Cook in his book calls it the red needle burn, but a lot of experienced commercial mushroom pickers, they'll get up on a vantage point and look at the forest fire. And wherever you see the trees that are still holding on to their orange needles, those are the areas they go to. The fire didn't get too hot. If it's a complete decimation and the trees are just gone or just completely black, you're not going to find morels very much in those areas, but they still can be found sometimes. But really, it's where the needles are still hanging on the trees and the needles are on the ground. Wherever there's needles all over, orange needles all over the floor, that's a great place to look. Low depressions and creek beds where the water can accumulate, these little tributaries that come down the river, the hills and the fire, all good places. So soil temps, 52 degrees for a week. Another good thing to look for, I didn't put in here, is the little burn cups, so sometimes they'll be orange cups and sometimes, but they're ascomycetes. So little cups, you see Pizziziales, little cups, and orange peel fungus, good sign that morels are on their way to that burn. So these pictures were taken at the Schneider Springs fire last year. That was a good burn. And just pulled tons of these conicas out of there. I would like to say sextillata, but I don't know if they're eximia or sextillata. So now I'm saying conica too, just like the old school pickers. This is interesting, World War morels. So this guy, John Ramsbottom, wrote in this book, described morels fruiting in the bomb craters and trenches, foxholes, and the ashes of the burned out buildings after World War II. They were finding morels growing everywhere after the war. So, with a lack of food, that's kind of interesting, and they could maybe make use of that. But the same thing happened at Mount St. Helens eruption here in 1980. Carpenter and Stamets described large numbers of morels fruiting in the aftermath of Mount St. Helens eruption, but all the mushrooms were completely encrusted in sand and ash, and they were uneatable. But people had truckloads of them coming out from the fires around the volcano that you just couldn't really eat. They were hosing them off and trying everything they could. But morels can get ruined that way. Sometimes a great flush of burned morels will pop up, and then it'll torrentially downpour, and they get this ash splash, they call it, and it's the water splashes the ashes and all the sand up on the mushrooms, and there's nothing worse than when you want to have a good morel meal and then you bite into it and you get that crunchy sand in your teeth. Oh, bummer. Morel crazy stories. In Germany, there's a law in the books that makes it illegal to set a forest on fire to hasten morel mushroom growth. That's right. Any burned area of timber should produce morels, according to their law. Time magazine in 1991 reported morels causing economic problems near Tok, Alaska. There was a forest fire in 1990 that created an overwhelming crop of morels. In June of 91, the economic problems began because people were quitting their jobs because they could make more money finding morels. And so one of the buyers said it doesn't get dark there, so people are just picking mushrooms all night. And I actually have some pictures a little later on about that particular burn and one of the commercial pickers that were there, one of the buyers. And, here he is. Randy Marchand and the crew of Northern Wild Harvest. If you watch YouTube and you like Mushroom Wonderland, you should check out Northern Wild Harvest. These guys are cool, and I want to go up there. So they live in Vancouver, BC, and they drive 3,000 kilometers to the Yukon to pick morels. In the spring, they set up camp, and they go out with these pack boards. And you can see each pack board will hold 7 or 8 different baskets on it, and they'll pick well over 100 pounds each every day of the season of morels. It is insane. And talk about some endurance to hike 15 miles carrying 130 pounds of morels on your back. Insane. But the channel is fascinating to me because it's not only finding these crazy fields of morels that there's something about finding morels that kind of hits a little dopamine sensor in you that, when you're a kid and you saw that golden Easter egg or whatever, that same kind of thing happens. And I think it would just be exhausting to see that many morels every day. You'd just be so drained from all that adrenaline, But they camp and they make delicious looking food. It's my favorite YouTube channel. And so I talked to these guys about maybe going up there. But Randy here, he's an old school buyer, picker from the 90s. And, now he stays at camp and makes meatballs and all this delicious food. And I'm like, I'll stay with Randy most of the time and come out with you guys and film for a couple days. But the guy in the red flannel is his son Phil, and him and I have been corresponding a lot. But their Randy's biggest season, he processed 150,000 pounds of wet morels. One day he dried 9,600 pounds of morels from pickers. So that was in 1991, and he had buyers lined up for miles. They were coming in with laundry baskets full of morels, and he dries them and sells them around the world. Who knows where they end up. But each of those racks hold 25 pounds of morels, and that picture doesn't even show half of them. And then they got indoor dryers too, so it's just mind-boggling the amount of morels.
This might be a stupid question, but what do you have to do to morels to clean them? I'm just thinking, what in the world do you have to do to process those?
Yeah, they lay them out on these screens, and then I'll show a picture, maybe in the next slide of, coming up. But they build these wood-fired stoves, and then they have a generator with squirrel fans, and they build this dryer system to dry these morels. If they can't sell them fresh, they dry them out, and they turn into popcorn. It's crazy. They don't lose their shape, but they're crispy. And they're bouncing around in these dryers, and it knocks the debris and the pine needles and stuff. But still, they're mushrooms, and so there's going to be some dirt and schmutz on them, And sometimes when you watch the video and you see how dirty these guys are, climbing around in the burn, sweating all day, picking mushrooms, you're like, I'm going to eat that? That is just in his hand? That's crazy. But Yeah, here's another large-scale drying operation that they're doing, 5,000 pounds of mushrooms a day. It's mind-boggling. So in the Yukon, they have these huge forest fires, and there's nobody really out there except for these commercial pickers that'll go out and they camp for 3 months and they chase morels every day. Sounds like a lot of fun, but it's a lot of work too. And there's bears and crazy, the wilderness up there is insane. The bugs will just eat you alive. They'll suck your blood and drink your tears, and it's pretty hardcore. There's Randy standing in front of more racks, and so they build these dryer houses. In that picture on the right, you can just see a little flash of red, but that's one of the generators. And so it's pretty cool. They have the rack system set up with these squirrel dryers, and they get it pretty hot in there and get them dried out, and then they flash dry them for the last 40 minutes or something, like right over really hot stuff, and it's supposed to kill any kind of larva and stuff like that, and it really gets that last little percentage of moisture out, and they're just crispy, beautiful, and they rehydrate like perfectly. So these guys are picking gray morels that are as big as like Nerf footballs up there. It's crazy. Sometimes I get excited when I see a patch of 30 morels, and then I see stuff like this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, man, it's mind-boggling. So.
And the rest of us get excited if we find 4.
Yeah. And those guys still eat morels like every night. They come back and they pick their favorite morels. I thought it was really interesting because he was going, ooh, this one I found underneath that log. And he goes, out of 10,000 mushrooms that I picked today, I still remember where every one came from. The human mind is just weird that way, you know what I mean? Because I'm the same way. I know exactly where I found that mushroom 6 years ago. It's just a real quick little look at Morel microscopy. So on the left are the asci, and you can see all of those little tubes, and they're full of spores, all those little ovoid shaped things are spores. So they produce just millions of spores. Each mushroom can produce millions of spores every day. So taking them out of the environment, you're actually getting them on your hands, you're sprinkling them as you go, they're on your clothes, they're everywhere, they're getting into the wind currents. You're doing them a favor by picking them, so don't be afraid to pick morels. And in that middle picture are some spores, not the greatest photos, I don't know, I thought that it might be interesting to just put some quick pictures up there because when I was new to mycology, I just found spores fascinating, and I didn't have a microscope, and I didn't know what they looked like, so it was always like, whoa, that's what they look like, cool. And then on the bottom right is just some of the cystidia, it's just cells that make up the mushroom. So the mushroom is exactly the same stuff as the hyphae is, as the mycelium. That mycelium is running through the substrate, through the ground, the wood, whatever, and then it just pushes up a cluster of its hyphae in the shape of a morel. It's really a fascinating process. Morel sexuality. So morels are ascomycetes, but they have both asexual and sexual reproductive phases. So they have sclerotia, that's something that I mentioned before, and it kind of looks like a rock or a chunk of dirt or something in that picture on the right. It's a hyphal mass for surviving adverse conditions. So there's 2 options for sclerotial germination. It can either germinate myceliogenically, so it can come back to life and start to grow a new mycelium, or it can germinate carpogenically, so it's a carpo, meaning the fruiting body, so it can come back to life and then grow fruiting bodies. And so that life cycle up there shows a mature fruiting body. It shows the asci and the spores in it. Then the spores germinate. They make a primary mycelium, and then it can go into the sclerotia phase and hunker down for years. And when the timing is right, it can germinate. That sclerotia can germinate back into a mycelium, continue the process into a secondary mycelium, and then go through another sclerotial phase. So it's really a confusing thing, and they've tried to duplicate this stuff in the lab and really struggled to get the sclerotia to do any germination in any laboratory setting. So frustrating for scientists. But they also produce conidia, which are small asexual spores that produce a white powder-like substance, usually in the winter. But the function of the conidia is still confusing, and it can't seem to be germinated in culture. So it's really confusing. But in this, I wish the resolution were better, but in this bottom left picture is a picture I took just a month ago, And if you look down on the bottom right, this was like a crater, like a hole in the ground. There's a morel popping out of there, a conica, like a Morchella sexullata, early burn morel. And there's a white frosting on that soil right there. And I've talked to other mycologists, and I think that that is the conidial phase, that white frost is conidia. And when they're cultivating these, which we're going to talk about in a minute also, that is one of the phases that lets them know that the process is working. They'll see all of the substrate get a frosty whiteness to it, and they go, oh, the conidia just kicked off. Right? And that's a microscopic photo of the conidia that's probably growing on agar. I don't know, I stole that from the internet. But. Cultivating morels, people have been cultivating morels for over 150 years with varied and inconsistent success. The first reports of outdoor cultivation, 1882, and in 1982, ascocarp formation, so a morel is called an ascocarp. It was reported at a lab in San Francisco State University under the research of R.D. Ower. Dubbed the father of morels, 3 patents were secured about the inoculation of the Morel sclerotia, and it was likely from the Rufo-Bernea clade. And then in 2005 to 2008, they were growing commercially in Michigan. It was funded by Tom Monaghan. He was the founder of Domino's Pizza, so the biggest pizza chain in the world. He found fascination in morels. He was like, I'm in, and he put all this money into this venture that was going to commercially grow morels indoors, but they just kept having failed crops, contamination. Then there was a financial recession, bacterial contamination. They gave up the project and just kind of abandoned it back in the 90s, or I mean in the late 2000s. So then there's the Danish Morel project. These guys, Jacob and Karsten Kirk, they're brothers. And they're from Copenhagen. They announced they devised a method to reliably cultivate heavy amounts of morels indoors year-round in a climate-controlled environment. It was called the Danish Morel Project. And you can see they were doing well, but they just kind of fizzled off. They're not doing it anymore. So one thing about growing morels, choosing the correct one. Rufo-Bernea, sexullata, eximia, those are the 2 conicas. And importuna, or landscape morel, they all live saprobically. They don't need trees to grow with. So China produces most of the cultivated morels, but they're outdoor in the spring. So not like the Danish Morel project. They're not growing them indoors year round. It's still just in the spring crop. So if you could figure out a way to grow them reliably and sell them late, in autumn, you'd be making a lot of money. 80 to 90% of the cultivated species in China are Morchella importuna, our common landscape morel that grows around here. A lot of people think they're inferior. I don't know. I think that they taste great too. So the process revealed. So the mycelium, the fungus, is started on potato dextrose agar, PDA, then it's transferred onto grain spawn after 15 days at 15 degrees Celsius. The spawn grows for 20 more days. Then it's mixed with a substrate consisting of sand and wood chips and plant ash, husks, probably soybean husk, wheat bran, and pH balancers. I think most of this information is like sort of vague because they don't want you to know the exact recipe. Humidity and temperature, again, major factors. The conidia phase in winter, that's something they're looking for, that white frost to go over their beds. So they make these beds that are raised with troughs in between them. And then comes the flooding and ENB placement. So the flooding, they run water down these channels to get enough humidity into that soil. Humidity being like one of the biggest factors in triggering the fruit of the mycelium. But the biggest factor, the ENB, the application of exogenous nutrition bags, is the most important breakthrough in the field of morel cultivation, but the mechanism still remains unclear. The nutrition bag, you can see in this picture, there's all these little bags that they lay all over after the conidial phase, they go out, they lay these bags full of a nutritional mixture. It's got wheat, chaff, sawdust, cottonseed hull, and they put 1.5 feet between each bag. They cut a couple little slits in the bag and they lay them down on the soil. Soil surface should be maintained at 80% humidity. Aside from many other contaminants, Caprinus can can take over the morel bed. So they'll be looking for morels, and shaggy manes will grow everywhere, and they'll be like, damn it, better pick those and eat them. But yeah, so it's interesting, these bags of nutritional stuff, they plant the spawn in the fall, it goes through the winter, the conidial phase, perhaps eats a lot of the nutrition that's there in that sandy wood chip soil, and then they put these exogenous nutrition bags, and then the mycelium actually climbs up into the bag and gets the nutrition and then sends a signal out to just spur fruiting, and you can see just thousands of morels growing right there. But again, it's seasonal, it's only in the spring, so they're gonna cut them all, sell them all, and we're still without morels in the fall. So there have been some recent morel poisonings in the news. I made a video about this, and so in Bozeman, Montana last year, 51 people were poisoned after eating morels at a sushi restaurant, which a sushi restaurant in Montana might be a red flag, just for starters, but they put raw morels and salmon into a Northwest style sushi roll. I actually called and got to talk to Aaron Parker. He's the chef and owner of Dave's Sushi, which was also a red flag because I was like, why isn't it called Aaron Sushi? I don't know. But he claimed to not know that you need to cook morels. And if ever since I heard him say that, as I've looked into every bit of any literature, everybody seems to know it's sort of a general rule to cook morels. But he's kind of playing dumb, and he's saying morels are dangerous. Well, he's taking liability. 2 people died. Donna Ventura, William Lewis, both died as a result of eating these raw morels. They both had underlying medical conditions and couldn't revive from the dehydration of the gastrointestinal stuff, right? So they were throwing up and had such bad diarrhea and stuff, their body just couldn't handle it. But it's been well known that you need to cook morels. They do contain some toxins. Now, the more confusing case that Aaron Parker pointed out to me in the defense of his restaurant was this case of this guy, Peter Dayton, who was from Missoula, Montana, a lawyer. He went on a kayaking trip with a friend and had a bag full of dried morels that he'd picked the year before. And they sat down to have dinner. He put the morels into a jet boil camp stove. He's picked morels. He's eaten morels. They put some Uncle Ben's instant risotto, mixed it up, had it. They both fell ill. Both were hospitalized. Unfortunately, Peter died and his friend survived. But, Aaron's defense was, well, this guy knew these were totally normal morels. He cooked them and everything. But what a lot of people seem to mistake is that because they're dried does not mean that they're cooked. So just putting your dried morels into the water and just fluffing them up is far from being cooked at a boil, at 189 degrees. So essentially, he still ate raw morels, and there could have been. So if I talked also to Dr. Michael Bugh, and he did an interview with me. He was the professor at Evergreen State College and the leader in fungal toxicology in North America. And he basically said that if you start to form an intolerance to morel mushrooms, like if you eat morels and you get sick where you're vomiting, sorry, don't eat them again, because the sensitivity is going to get stronger and it can become deadly. And perhaps that's what happened to Peter Dayton. Maybe he got sick prior to that from eating some morels and just kept his mouth shut, or who knows, you know what I mean? Maybe he had this sensitivity mixed with raw morels. Nonetheless, really freak and unfortunate occurrence, but still kind of puts a little okay, yeah, I'm going to make sure to cook my morels pretty well. It's unfortunate. It's terrible. So are morels toxic? Here's a graph over here. Morchellaceae. This is the MMH amount in various discomycetes. So this just shows Morchellaceae is kind of highlighted, and there's just a dash. They did studies and found no monomethylhydrazine. That's what MMH is. That is gyromitrin or helvelic acid. That is what is in the false morel that's so poisonous. Morchella doesn't show any. They contain heat-liable toxins called hemolysins, which can cause the breakdown of red blood cells. The toxic compounds do not withstand the heat of cooking. However, if consumed raw, a number of disorders may occur. Besides hemolysis, gastroenteritis, and neurological symptoms are known to happen. There's evidence that raw morels, maybe even cooked, produce some degree of hemolysis, but this does not appear to be the main mechanism for its toxicity. Consuming raw or undercooked morels may produce symptoms of moderately intense gastroenteritis along with the usual cluster of indigestion symptoms. So if you can't recover from dehydration of a heavy gastrointestinal upset, it could be very dangerous for you. There is something after eating morels, and it's interesting, you can read a lot about it on the internet, different cases of what they call cerebellar syndrome. It's a set of dizziness, tremors, lack of stability, vertigo when standing or walking, somewhat similar to people who have drank too much. In general, it occurs a day after consuming the morels. In some cases, it's mild and temporary, and others it can last for several weeks. You're feeling dizzy and vertigo and gross after eating morels. If you have that happen to you, it's probably a good idea to discontinue eating morels because you're having an adverse reaction. It could probably get worse. My favorite way is to eat morels up here, tempura fried. I do a yakisoba stir fry with morels. I just like to have them be the star of the show. Down on the bottom left was a steak that I just had Sunday night with a bunch of Morchella, Snyderi, and we have a stir fry, and then down there some panko fried morels. So be sure to check out my channel, Mushroom Wonderland, or come to my website, mushroom-wonderland.com, and that's all I got. Thank you.